The Andy Pollin Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, figuring they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
All right, many of you have an eye on the Masters, as I do. We're not going to have the leaders tee off until a bit later on, just before the end of the show. Bryson DeChambeau, 7 under, will tee off, and Scotty Scheffler, who's just a shot back, doesn't go until close to 2 o'clock this afternoon. But after all these years and all the surgeries and all the personal problems that he's had, all eyes are still on Tiger Woods. And when we didn't believe 5 years ago, he won. That was before the horrific car accident, which nearly cost him his leg. But he's back out playing. Watched a lot of him yesterday, and he's got a fused ankle, as he says. Doesn't really have much of a limp, and is hanging in there. He's at even par through 16 today, so he's got to play 2 more holes today and then take a break and then come back and play another 18. Whew. That's worst weather case scenario really for him yesterday with an afternoon tee time, in that he didn't tee off until close to 4 o'clock, and it just got too dark to continue after 12. So he had to play 6 today and then another 18 today. Can he keep up the streak of 24 consecutive cuts at the Masters? It's going to be tough, but it's possible. The projected cut right now is 2 over par. He's at even par, so, if he hangs in the rest of the day, maybe that happens. But the reality of winning right now, oh, man. And what we've seen from him when he does play is that he gets worse as the tournament goes on, because the physical wear and tear adds up. You're walking about 6 miles when you play 18 holes, and so you add another 3 today where he's playing 6 more, or 2, whatever. That's a lot of walking on reconstructed legs and back surgeries and all the other problems that he's had. And as he said in his news conference the other day, I hurt all the time. So it would be a miracle, but it's possible. And I think that the big goal would be to make the cut. And we'll see by the end of the day what happens. But, Masters off and running. And if you're a golf person, you're into that. I watch golf. I don't play golf. Looking forward to watching 18 on Sunday, even though Tiger is unlikely to be in it. I like to watch the majors. And a little bit later on this hour, we'll hear from Vern Lundquist reliving the 2005 call of Tiger's chip, where the ball hung on the lip and finally went in miraculously, and they made a Nike commercial out of it because the ball had a Nike swoosh on it. The backstory of how they got that shot is interesting, because it involves new technology that came that year. If that happens the year before, maybe we don't have that magical piece of television that we had in 2005. And Vern will talk about that. But I am going to spend most of the next 2 hours on OJ Simpson. And I know that you may be even sick of it, hearing about it by now, because it was towards the end of the show yesterday. So just before 11 o'clock, it broke that OJ had passed away of cancer at the age of 76. And the reactions, somewhat predictable. They went to Ron Goldman's father, who had been very outspoken about OJ for many years, kind of had disappeared from the spotlight. But Fred Goldman had been very much a visible part of this incredible drama that played out over years. And he said it was no great loss, which, really no surprise there. Stephen A. Smith, who always specializes in the sensational, says he hopes he rots in hell. And others probably have the same feeling. I don't think that there's any real sadness on his passing. He was a life that had many, many twists and turns. And there's a really good piece that was written today in the Washington Post, and it's written by a black columnist. Eugene Robinson wrote about this, and he makes this point. I think it's well put about how O.J. was always on the run, and talked about how, as a college football player, he specialized in elusiveness. And in fact, when O.J. Simpson left college, and he only played 2 years because he went to a junior college, so he played his junior and senior year at USC, and set the all-time rushing record. I think it was 1,800 yards, which has since been broken. But he was kind of like, it's hard to imagine this, College football was on a different plane than women's basketball for sure, but he had a similar effect on college football that Caitlin Clark had on women's basketball. People were paying attention. Now, maybe it's partly me because I was coming of age at that time. When OJ was a senior at USC, I was 10 years old, and I was really starting to have a sense of sports, and there weren't that many college football games that were televised at that time. But the Rose Bowl was the biggest of the bowls, the most prestigious, the granddaddy of them all. You watched the Rose Bowl. You watched OJ Simpson have a spectacular game, 2 of them, as a matter of fact. And then, of course, the UCLA game, which is the big rivalry game, they would televise that as well. So when there weren't that many college football games televised, you paid attention to OJ Simpson. And more importantly about him was that he was a crossover superstar at a time when there was great racial strife in this country. And I was aware of it because I do remember the riots after Martin Luther King's death earlier in 1968, April of 68. So by the time he won the Heisman Trophy in December, I had a sense of where things stood in terms of black and white in this country. Yes, I grew up in a mostly white suburb of Chevy Chase, Maryland. I did not live in an inner city or anything like that. I had no real sense of that. But O.J. Simpson was someone, as we look back, someone who made white people feel comfortable at a time when there was, real division on both sides, and it still is, unfortunately. But O.J. was a crossover superstar, and 2 things worked in his favor. 1, he was charismatic, and 2, he was playing in Los Angeles. He was playing in one of the top media cities in the country, and he gravitated towards the cameras. The cameras gravitated towards him. I think he was doing commercials like right after his USC career ended. And then, and here's one of the really cool side stories of all this. You've heard that they booed Santa Claus at wasn't even Veterans Stadium yet. It was Franklin Field where the Eagles were playing in the 1968 season. So in December of 68, they booed Santa Claus famously. And part of the reason that the Eagle fans were so grouchy was that they had won the week before on the road. So they came home with 2 wins, which put them behind the Buffalo Bills in the draft, and they knew that Buffalo was going to get O.J. Simpson, and they were going to have to settle for second, which they did, and it was Leroy Keys, who didn't really have a great NFL career. O.J. did have a great NFL career and was, at one time, the biggest star in the NFL. I mean, if you can imagine this, if you can imagine O.J. Simpson in 1969, 1970, into like the early 70s, 73, 74, when he was really at his peak, it'd be kind of like what Patrick Mahomes now is, except they didn't win. He was on a team that I don't think he ever played in a playoff game. And he still managed to make himself a star, both on the field and off the field, with commercial after commercial. He did, and he made you feel safe. Arnold Palmer and O.J. did Hertz commercials together. I'm sure he did an orange juice commercial. O.J., Orenthal James. And he was somebody that you looked at in the way that I think people look at Mahomes now and Peyton Manning, because he did a lot of acting on the side. Even early in his career, he was on television shows, and then he started to be in the Naked Gun movies and all that. He was really someone that people looked up to and felt safe around. I mean, it's just so ironic that was the feel, but that was he and I would say, and here's another ironic part of this, Bill Cosby. They were considered to be very comfortable black people to whites. They were, they stayed away from discussions about race. They didn't talk about their race. They talked about, whatever it was, whether it was O.J. and he, portrayed himself as a family man, even though we now know he was a serial cheater. But, the people he mixed with made you believe, okay, this is we're moving forward in society, and here's someone who has assimilated himself very well. We learned things were different. But back to the Eugene Robinson column, and he writes about his elusiveness on the football field, and that segues into what happened in the biggest trial of the 20th century. It was, in fact, the trial of the century. And he writes, as theater and as a legal circus, Simpson's murder trial has never been surpassed or even equaled. Its characters were vivid to the point of being indelible. Eager to please Judge Lance Ito, dutiful but overmatched prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, slick and razor-sharp defense lawyers Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, house guest Cato Kalin, Simpson friend and counselor Robert Kardashian, and then racist detective Mark Furman in a non-speaking role, the Bloody Glove. Throughout his career as a football player, actor, and celebrity, Simpson had scrupulously avoided saying anything about issues involving race. He reportedly used to tell friends, "I'm not black, I'm OJ." Indeed, he was so beloved because he was seen as a non-confrontational and non-threatening person. Faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, however, he embraced his blackness. He professed new racial consciousness, allowed some black Americans, certainly not all, to at least consider the possibility that he was yet another black man being brutalized by a racist justice system. After all, the trial was taking place just 3 years after the Los Angeles riots sparked by the police officers who savagely beat Rodney King and were judged to have done nothing wrong. The evidence against Simpson was overwhelming, even though the murder weapon, a knife, was never found. The trial took 11 months. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach its shocking verdict, not guilty. And he writes, I have not a scintilla of doubt that he committed the murders. In 2007, Simpson even had the gall to write a book, If I Did It, which he said it was a hypothetical narrative of how he could have committed the crime, but of course he didn't. He often blathered on about how police should be looking for the real killers, who were supposedly still out there somewhere. Of course, he went to jail in 2008 for the armed robbery, 33-year prison sentence, which turned out to be 9 years. And Robinson concludes his column by saying, it was a diminished life, to be sure. He had just a fraction of his one-time wealth and status. His celebrity was one of the most of tarnished kind. His need for adulation would never again be required. He was a pariah. But O.J. Simpson died a free man. He zigged and zagged all his life and never quite got caught. And that is a fitting summation of the life of O.J. Simpson, and well put by Eugene Robinson. Let me get into some of the history of this. And I followed his career as a player and watched him as a broadcaster, as an actor. He had self-deprecating humor. I mean, there was a lot of things to like about him. He wasn't particularly really good at any of this. Maybe in commercials. He wasn't a good actor. He wasn't good in the Monday Night Booth. And at one time, he teamed up with Joe Namath, two of the biggest stars of the 1960s into the 70s. But he wasn't good at any of that. But there was a likableness about him. And then it all changed. And as I remember this, there was, when his, first of all, they had the brutal murders on a Sunday night. So we wake up Monday morning to the news that O.J. Simpson's wife and a friend had been brutally murdered. The furthest thing from your mind is that O.J. did it, right? Week goes on, you don't hear much about it. And then by the end of the week, police go to investigate in his house, and they say he is not a suspect. Yet we have video of O.J. being handcuffed. And while this is going on, we still are told he's not a suspect. And as I said yesterday, I remember Tony Kornheiser looking up at the screen and saying, O.J. can't be a suspect. He can't be. And that's how most of us looked at him then. Like, no, this is impossible, even though we were hearing things during the week like, yeah, maybe there was this and there was this blood found and blah, blah, blah. No, it was impossible to believe. And, of course, as time went on, we found out that there was a lot about O.J. that we didn't know. And Tony had traveled in circles that O.J. traveled in, whether it was covering games or I guess Tony probably even covered him as a player. And so it was unthinkable that this could happen. And in a column written today by Richard Hoffer in SI.com, he said, if we didn't know Simpson, one of the most accessible celebrities of our time, well, we really didn't know anybody. His easy, non-threatening grin was a part of our celebrity culture, for sure. And as Tony once said, years later, he said, in this post-OJ world, we really don't know anybody, right? Especially celebrities. And as Hoffer concludes in his column, it's interesting to note that the Las Vegas case, that's the one where he, with a gun, went in with his buddies to collect his memorabilia, and that's what ultimately sent him to jail for 9 years. He says it's interesting to note that the Las Vegas case, a civic comeuppance of sorts, attracted almost no attention. A few cameras, some tabloid coverage, hardly anything else. The mainstream media, which had acted almost in outrage after he mocked our certainty about his character in the first go-round, now found him too transparent for our interest without the capacity for surprise. It took some time, but we had gotten to know him after all, and that is really well written. I'll get into some of the history of this and how things unfolded after the arrest and even leading up to the arrest. Plus, there's a couple of really good stories that have spilled out or been sitting like in YouTube storage for years, and when you look at them now through the prism of his death, they're very interesting, and they're like, oh wow, I didn't really know that. Like one that Jeff Van Gundy tells. There's Bob Costas' story about visiting him in prison. There's an interview story that Dan Patrick has from about 20 years ago. All those things. We'll get to that and much more as we continue. We will do a few other things today, but spend a lot of time on OJ as we continue. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
We're spending the bulk of the time today on the OJ Simpson story. It has, in many ways dominated the news for the last 30 years. The OJ Made in America documentary, which won an Academy Award, came out in 2017. That's 23 years after OJ was arrested for the double murder. And there was still incredible interest in the story. I mean, there has been, 3 decades of interest in this salacious story. It changed everything in the way we view celebrity, in the way that we view entitlement, culture. It opened the eyes of many people about how big the racial divide was in this country. And it has reverberated now for 3 decades on that. So as I look back on it, and I always like to look at things through the prism of history, some things you forget along the way. And heck, if you're under 40, you probably have no real recollection of the trial. But if you're over that, you do remember the dailiness of this for 11 months of how it, every single day televised live on TV. It changed the viewing habits. It made celebrities out of the people who covered it, like Jeffrey Toobin and Greta Van Susteren. They became, household names because of their OJ coverage. You needed to have attorneys disseminate the information that was coming out, and just as a layman, you hear these things that there's a sock. It's got Nicole's blood, it's got Ron Goldman's blood, and it's got OJ's blood on. You go, well, slam dunk, trial's over, guilty. Nope, that's not the way it played out, and it played out that way for a variety of reasons, including race, and race was a big part of what happened in that trial. And in the end, the trial really wasn't about whether or not OJ had killed 2 people. It was about whether a black man could get a fair trial in this country. And the starkness of the celebration of African Americans when the news was announced that OJ was acquitted was celebration and tears from people who were white. And it was just so eye-opening in 1995 when that happened. But back to where this all begins. The brutal murders. The bodies are found. Nicole's was almost decapitated in this. Both of them brutally murdered with a knife in this. There's no weapon there. There's blood stains everywhere. OJ's not in sight, but he had been, I guess, on a plane to Chicago. He had a red-eye flight that night, so he's out of town, and he doesn't really come to realization, the country, until about the middle of the week. So this Sunday night murders, probably by Wednesday or Thursday, you see OJ in handcuffs, but not a suspect. But then Friday, we get word that OJ has to turn himself in. So the plan is he's going to turn himself into the Los Angeles Police Department on Friday afternoon. doesn't show up. And finally, there's an announcement from a detective who says, OJ Simpson is now a fugitive of justice. We don't know where he is. We don't know. And then we find out the name for the first time, and you think about the last 30 years, what a household name Kardashian is. This wasn't the Kim Kardashians, or no. This was the ex-husband Robert Kardashian, who was an OJ friend, a buddy. They used to play golf together, did things together, hung out together, and he's up at the stand where the detective has just announced that OJ is a fugitive, and he's got a lengthy letter that OJ has written, in which he first says that he has nothing to do with the murder of Nicole. But as he reads the letter, it's pretty clear this is a suicide note. I mean, I don't know how you can interpret it any other way. He's talking about how, he has regrets, how he lived his life, how he loved Nicole, and all this has happened, and this, that, and the other. So I'm gonna play some of that. But one of the things he talks about in this letter is his relationship with Nicole. And the Post this morning did a very good front page obit on OJ. It's written by Rick Mace, Glenn Frankel, and Matt Schutel. And I'll read a few paragraphs here which tells you about the relationship. He met her when she was 18 years old. She was a waitress just out of high school. And he started living with Nicole while he was still married. They divorced. Marguerite, he had two kids or three kids with her. They divorced in 1979, and he married Nicole in 1985, about the time he went in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Their marriage was what today would have resulted in an arrest for OJ, but this tells you about the times of the 1980s. Nicole Simpson made at least 8 911 calls to police for protection. In 1985, she called for help, saying that Simpson had smashed her car windshield with a baseball bat. A more severe incident came on New Year's Day, 1989. Nicole Simpson called 911 at about 3 a.m., and when a police car arrived, she jumped from the bushes outside the house wearing only a bra and sweatpants. Police reported she had a black eye, cut lip, and purple bruises on her face and neck. Quote, "He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me," she cried. A furious Simpson, OJ, emerged from the house dressed in a bathrobe. The police officers told him he was under arrest, but allowed him to go inside and change his clothes. He stormed out again a few minutes later, got into his Bentley, and sped away. Police did not pursue him, nor did they charge him with resisting arrest. Simpson was fined and placed on probation after pleading guilty to spousal battery. 3 months later, NBC Sports signed him to a new broadcast contract. So that tells you kind of what was going on at the time. OJ later did an interview with Roy Firestone on ESPN, which Firestone regrets to this day, where they just said, they kind of laughed the whole thing off. Not laughed it off, but really minimized it. Oh, yeah, we had a little thing. But apparently the police were coming to OJ's house, and he would just kind of say, yeah, nothing big deal. And they'd say, okay, Juice, and they'd dap him up and they'd leave. And this kind of abuse was continuing. She finally left him in 1992. And so this is now 1994. It's June 17th. We've heard from the police officer that OJ is on the run. We don't know where he is. And then Robert Kardashian, never heard this name before, Robert Kardashian gets up and reads part of a letter, or reads an entire letter, this part of it discussing what OJ views as the relationship that he had with Nicole.
Unlike what has been written in the press, Nicole and I had a great relationship for most of our lives together. Like all long-term relationships, we had a few downs and ups. I took the heat New Year's 1989 because that's what I was supposed to do. I did not plead no contest for any other reason but to protect our privacy, and was advised it would end the press hype. I don't want to belabor knocking the press but I can't believe what is being said. Most of it is totally made up. I know you have a job to do, but as a last wish, please, 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 Leave my children in peace. Their lives will be tough enough.
So last wish here, speaking about his life in the past tense at that point. And this is, to me, it's about a 5 or 6 minute read of the letter. This is the most indicative part of it to me, that this, in fact, was a suicide note.
I've had a good life. I'm proud of how I lived. My mama taught me to do unto others. I treated people the way I wanted to be treated. I've always tried to be up and helpful. So why is this happening? I'm sorry for the Goldman family. I know how much it hurts. Nicole and I had a good life together. All this press talk about a rocky relationship was no more than no more than what every long-term relationship experiences. All her friends will confirm that I have been totally loving and understanding of what she's been going through. At times, I have felt like a battered husband or boyfriend.
So that letter is read, and then some of us settle in to watch the NBA Finals that night. It's Game 5 between the Rockets and the Knicks. This is the year that Michael Jordan did not play. He'd won 3 straight championships and then retired, sat out the entire 93-94 season. And it's the Rockets and the Knicks playing for the championship at Madison Square Garden. But then comes word that there is a white Bronco slowly driving down the 405 in Los Angeles, and it becomes apparent that OJ is in the car. A couple of people spot him. It's Al Cowlings, his buddy, driving the car. He and AC had been friends since they played together at USC, and he was a year behind OJ and such a star in OJ's mind, and they were close friends, and OJ had become such a star in Buffalo. He told the Bills to draft him in the first round the next year. So AC and OJ are reunited in Buffalo. They become lifelong friends. AC wants to be OJ. I mean, it's pretty clear when you'll hear this 911 call. In fact, after they towed away the white Bronco, when OJ finally went home, there was another white Bronco, an identical one in the driveway. Go, how did that get there? AC bought the exact same car that OJ did. Everything OJ did, AC did. So this was we got the car driving down the freeway. The helicopters are looking at it, and this is all the networks are televising this live. And NBC has no choice really but to go to a split screen because they know nobody's going to watch the basketball game if they don't put this on. And so this is what people are watching. And people in Madison Square Garden, now remember, this is before smartphones. Some people had cell phones, but the word begins to filter through that there's this chase going on, and OJ's in the car with a gun to his head. And people leave their seats, paid big money to sit in the seats, watch the NBA Finals at Madison Square Garden so they can go up on the concourse and watch the small TVs near the concession stand so they can watch the chase. Everybody in America is captivated by this because, you assume that this is going to end badly. And you've heard what sounds like a suicide note that he's written, and it looks like, at some point he's going to kill himself. And then we get this as the TV coverage is going live, and we get this recording of a call that Al Cowlings has made to 911. You know who I am. That was his mindset. Like, well, how dare you ask who I am? I'm AC. And so this is now going on, and this is going on for hours and hours. And people are lined up on the freeway with signs that say, "Go, OJ, go." This is a man who's going to be arrested for double murder. And celebrity, we find out, I think we get a real picture of it now, that celebrity trumps everything. That he is now something of a hero because he's a celebrity. He had been a hero, a football hero. He had been, popular in commercials and television shows and movies and so forth. But he's accused of double murder. And people are yelling, "Go, OJ, go," which was, so ironic because one of the Hertz commercials, he's running through the airport and a woman says, "Go, OJ, go." That was also a catchphrase of the early 70s, 20 years before this. And it's just, you just bash your head against the wall. You go, how can this be? This is unbelievable. So finally, he winds up going home. This is what that Cowling said he wanted to do. Wanted to see his mother. He knew he was going to be arrested, and they're going to drive home. The media coverage is everywhere, the helicopters, the whole thing. Al Michaels jumps on the ABC coverage because he knows OJ and he knows the neighborhood, and they're trying to figure out what's going to happen here. Is he going to pull up to the house? Is he going to kill himself? Is he going to be arrested? I mean, so many things. This is reality TV at its height here. It doesn't get any more reality than this. This is live reality TV. And he pulls into the driveway, and his son comes running out, and the older son, not the young son who he had with Nicole, but he comes out, and then they rush him back into the house, and finally he goes into the house, and it was told by the police detective, the same one, I think his name was Gil Garcetti, if I'm not mistaken, who said that OJ was on the run. He said, yes, OJ went into his house. We allowed him to go to the bathroom and drink a glass of orange juice. OJ orange juice. Okay. Then he is arrested and he's taken to jail. The trial doesn't really start for a year. Yeah, he's arrested in '94. He's in jail, and you don't really know any of the details of this. There are some things that are trickling out, but this thing doesn't really get rolling until 1995. It's a full year, and we hear things during the trial that are just mind blowing. I mean, you think in terms of how evidence is looked at now with DNA and so forth, but in those days, you didn't really have a great sense of DNA testing. This was somewhat new in that people who had been in jail for a long time for crimes that they didn't commit, new evidence would surface, or there would be pieces of DNA that they would look at, and they would find, oh yeah, that person is innocent. Well, this was overwhelming what they found. And let me just read this part here where they talk about, yes, here it is. Investigators found blood samples from the victims in Simpson's home and car. They also found blood from Simpson at the murder scene, human hairs on a dark knit cap, and Ron Goldman's clothing that matched those of Mr. Simpson, and a pair of bloody leather gloves, one at the crime scene, the other left behind at his guest house. Simpson had no verifiable alibi for the time of the killings, but the prosecution had no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, and the burden of relying on a police department with a long history of racism. And that's how it all played out with the story of Mark Furman doing an interview with a woman who was doing a graduate project. These were on cassette tapes where he used the N-word, and F. Lee Bailey was able to get that into court and get that into the bloodstream. Johnny Cochran said, oh, yeah, this is a knit cap, but this could be anybody's. And he put a knit cap on his head, and he said, who do I look like? Nobody can tell what I look like, the knit cap. And then the bloody glove, which may have been one of the biggest downfalls in the trial, in that Christopher Darden, who was assisting Marcia Clark, the prosecutor in this, had him try on the glove in court, and everybody knew that the glove had shrunk from being soaked in blood, and OJ putting his hands out wide was going to show that the glove didn't fit, and Johnny Cochran was able to say the now famous line, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. And they couldn't wait to acquit because the deliberation initially by the jury, and the jury was made up of mostly black women. And Marcia Clark was in favor of that, the prosecutor, because she thought that they would be sympathetic to Nicole in that she was a battered woman, and that they would have as women they would have an understanding of what she went through, and would be more likely to convict OJ. That didn't happen, and finally in September of 1995, actually October 3rd, 1995. This was announced in the courtroom with O.J. Simpson standing up with his dream team of attorneys, F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, Robert Shapiro, and Johnny Cochran, of course, and this was announced.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, as charged in Count 1 of the information. We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant Orenthal James Simpson not guilty of the crime of murder in violation of Penal Code Section 187A, a felony upon Ronald Lyle Goldman, a human being, as charged in Count 2 of the information.
And the wailing that you hear in the background is Ron Goldman's sister, who sat with her father, Fred Goldman, for the entire trial. And it was an incredibly emotional day. I remember it well. I remember my mother crying about the verdict, and that there were many, not all blacks felt this way, obviously, and not all whites felt this way. But it seemed to go on a racial divide that, okay, finally a black man was treated fairly in court, and others looked at the overwhelming amount of evidence here and said, how can this be? How can two people have been slaughtered in this way? And the evidence points to clearly O.J. Simpson, and he's going to walk free. And that's what he did. And ultimately, he did go to jail, but for something unrelated. And that plays into the story as well. But there's a lot of other backstories with this. I want to get to what Bob Costas said about his prison visit with O.J. in 1994 while he was awaiting trial. And also Dan Patrick tells the story of an O.J. interview about 20 years ago. And they're enlightening. And there's also an incredible story that Jeff Van Gundy tells when he was doing the NBA Finals in 2017, I believe, so 7 years ago, that he told about what happened in the aftermath of that. We'll get to all of that and more as we continue. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630. All right, we're wrapping up the week. Mike Callow sits in for Tony at 11 o'clock, and we got a lot more to talk about in the death of O.J. Simpson, and remembering how this country was just obsessed with this celebrity trial that took place in 1995, the murders in 1994. O.J. acquitted of those, but kind of stayed in the spotlight, kind of had a smirk on his face as he lived in Los Angeles, then went to Florida, then finally in 2008 he went to jail. Went to jail for something totally unrelated. Some memorabilia had been taken from him, and he showed up with some buddies and a gun, and he went to jail for armed robbery for 9 years. Got a 33-year sentence. Conceivably could have died in jail, but got out in 2017 and lived out the rest of his life in Las Vegas, got on Twitter. You know, he kept himself in the public eye, but was a pariah. But some of the stories that have been told and are being retold now that happened over the years, we went through the crazy night of June 17th. In the afternoon, he was supposed to turn himself into the LAPD. He did not. Then we find out he's on the freeway with his buddy Al Cowlings in the now infamous white Bronco. They lead a chase through the 405, but they're driving very slowly. As Jeff Van Gundy told the story, that Al Cowlings later said that they were driving slowly because he wanted to be in the car for the end of the NBA Finals Game 5 between the Rockets and the Knicks. And that now there's also, well, later years, we find out there's a story that O.J. had attempted to call Bob Costas from the car. Costas is broadcasting the game at Madison Square Garden. I believe I don't remember the exact timing of this, but I guess he was the announcer at that time. Marv Albert may have left NBC at that point. Whatever it was, he was part of the broadcast, either pregame or doing the play-by-play. And he knew him. You know, they had been buddies working together at NBC. And so the story of how OJ did not connect with Bob Costas courtside is incredible. And that's followed by a second part of the story that Costas tells of visiting OJ in jail while he is awaiting trial. The trial doesn't start until 1995. He's arrested in June of 94 and is sitting in jail. This is November of 94. So this is Costas on Graham Bensinger's show a couple of years ago, recalling the story of the phone call from OJ that never got through, followed by the visit to OJ in prison.
Well, OJ and I had been very friendly. We worked on the football show together for a number of years on NBC. OJ was a very affable man. I had no real understanding of some of the domestic violence that took place in his relationship with Nicole. And so all of us were stunned when we heard about the murders on a Sunday night, and our first thought was, oh, what a tragedy for OJ and his family. And then, as 48, 72 hours went by, the realization set in, he's a suspect here. Now, Friday is when they announced that they're seeking his arrest, but he's disappeared. And they announced that he's a fugitive. You can hear all the reporters gasping, like this is something out of a B movie. That night is Game 5 of the NBA Finals at Madison Square Garden between the Knicks and the Rockets. So when the world finally comes to understand that he's making his way down the 405 slow-speed Bronco chase, almost every other network and station goes live to that, and the whole country is transfixed by it. But Dick Ebersol has to make a decision. And so part of the time, they go to Tom Brokaw, who's at 30 Rock. I'm at Madison Square Garden. Marv Albert's calling the game. I have to kind of bridge between Tom and Marv. And of course, at that time, you don't know what's going to happen. We know that he just got out of the car at his house in Brentwood and gave himself up peacefully. But you didn't know if he'd kill himself. You didn't know if there'd be a gun battle when he got out of the car. You had no idea. He says he's got a gun to his head. A.C. Cowlings, his former Buffalo teammate and longtime friend, is telling the police that that's what's going on. Okay, so we do what we do. The Knicks win the game. So I'm sitting around the hotel on Monday, and a woman whose name I forget, never heard it before or since, from Time Magazine calls and says, we hear that OJ tried to call you from the Bronco. And I say, truthfully, I think, no, that never happened. Okay, the conversation lasts a minute. Now fast forward several months. It's November of 94. The trial doesn't start till January. He's in the LA County Jail. He had sent word through intermediaries that when I was in Los Angeles, he'd like to see me. So Robert Kardashian, who's part of his defense team, picks me up at the hotel and takes me to the LA County Jail. And it's me, A.C. Cowlings, and Kardashian on one side of the glass, and OJ in a blue prison outfit, looked to me like he'd lost about 20 pounds. He comes walking in, sits on a stool opposite us, and the way you shake hands is you put your hand up against the glass. And I had cut my finger, so I had a bandage, this is no joke, I had a bandage on my finger, and this little bit of blood, and he goes, wait a minute, you did it. Like it's a joke, right? And so we sit there, and the whole time he's, gently trying to convince me that he couldn't possibly have done this. If I did do something like this, I'm a smart guy. Would I leave a glove in the driveway? And I'm thinking, without saying it, once you cross this unthinkable line and do something like this, if you did, then all bets are off about your past patterns of behavior. But what I said to everything he said was, well, you'll have a chance to tell your story in court. At one point, A.C. Cowlings pipes up and he says, we tried to call you from the back of the Bronco. Now I'm thinking about the lady from Time Magazine. And he called my house in St. Louis. I wasn't there. And he had the number of the studio. But since it was the finals, we were at the site. We're at Madison Square Garden. So he calls, the phone rings, and finally someone picks it up, and it's a tech guy, an engineer. Bob Costas there? No, he's not there. I got to speak to Bob Costas. He's not here. I have to speak to Bob Costas right now. He's at Madison Square Garden. I have to speak to him. Who's calling? OJ Simpson. Yeah, right. Click. And the guy hangs up the phone because what would you think? It's a prank.
Right.
Okay? So I don't find out about this till months later. Now, if somehow we had actually connected, it was already one of the most memorable moments in television history. It's like the moon landing. Everyone's watching it. But I would have had to have asked him some rather pointed questions, regardless of what his answers would have been. OJ, did you do it? If you didn't do it, what are you doing running? What are you doing with a gun to your head in the back of the car? But it never came to pass. And that was the last time that I saw or spoke to OJ.
It was.
Yeah, November of 1994.
How about that? So it'd been almost 20 years, 30 years since Costas talked to OJ Simpson, and he was a person that was very much a part of the mainstream big time media. He was somebody who was part of the NBC coverage. He worked on Monday Night Football. He was at the level. Didn't have the talent of Bob Costas, but he was moving in that same stratosphere there. And they never talked again after that, which, I think is indicative of how most people felt about him, even those who knew him well. There were some, Dick Ebersol apparently knew him well, and Norm Macdonald had taken off on OJ on a lot of his stuff on Saturday Night Live, and that's been reported as the reason they fired Norm Macdonald from Saturday Night Live, because he was doing too many OJ jokes. But, this took on. I mean, think of the terrible, terrible tragedy of this. And then the celebrity culture that engulfs the whole trial and everything else that's going on with it. And it becomes, something that's really hard to get your head around. Now, there were interviews that were done with OJ over the years, some of them not long after he got out of jail, after he was acquitted on the murders. I remember Chris Myers did one on ESPN where they said there's no time limit on this. But OJ had become the biggest expert on the OJ murders. So, he could filibuster on things, and they never got really to the point of anything. I watched the whole thing. It went at least an hour, and they never really got anywhere. Dan Patrick, who probably should have known better, even over 20 years ago, came up with an idea to interview OJ in 2003 and do it when USC was playing in the Rose Bowl. This is January of 2003, so it's a little over 21 years ago. And several years ago on his show, he recounted what he did in getting OJ to sit down for an interview.
I'm down in Coconut Grove in Miami. I have this idea of interviewing OJ and talking sports with OJ. Not one of my better moments, folks. So it had to be, I'm going to say, January of 2003, I think. Is that right, Paulie?
Yep.
Okay, January of 2003. I say to, the guys at the mothership, what about OJ talking about USC football? Because, look, is he ever going to be charged for the murders? No, he's not. He's walked free. Okay, whatever. He was still one of the great football players I ever saw. And a USC guy, so I thought maybe he talks USC football. Maybe. I mean, in my grand scheme here. So I'd sit down with OJ. And he came in, he looked frail. I mean, he wasn't imposing. And he came in with one other guy. That was it. And I remember my camera crew said, do we have to shake his hand? I said, no. I said, I invited him here. I will shake his hand because I'm inviting him here to do this interview. You guys don't have to. And they said, good, we don't want to. I said, fine. Do the interview. And what I don't realize is my body language is I'm leaning back in my chair as I'm interviewing him. So I'm just sort of like as if he's going to pull out a knife and stab me. For some reason, in my mind, I'm just sort of leaning back away from him. We shoot 30 minutes of an interview during the minutes where you change tapes. And we're just sitting there. I'm 3 feet away from him, and there's no conversation. Because I think he should have been in prison, and I think he killed those two people. So in my mind, I'm going, all right, I'm having you here to answer football questions. And he said, you think I did it? And I said, did what? And they said, killed those two people. And I said, Yes. And then it seemed like there was 3 to 4 minutes of silence. Cameraman says, all right, we're ready to go. We resumed the interview. We got done. And then he wanted to talk about, the case. He wanted to tell me why he was innocent. And I said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. He said, you think I'm guilty? I said, it doesn't matter. And then he walked out. The guys who were my camera crew, they had worked on a shoot in Mexico with OJ prior, leading up to that. And they said that he was fascinated with the Navy SEAL knives. Fascinated with them. And wanted Navy SEAL knives before the killing. So one of those moments where you came back home and you just want to take a shower and just say, terrible, terrible mistake by me.
Yeah, and many felt that way who attempted interviews with him. He became very good at being OJ, and such a different OJ, and that's why I'll wrap up here on OJ with kind of where I started. Again, I was 10 years old, and he was the first big-time celebrity college football player that I could remember. There had been others, obviously, before him, but there weren't very many games televised, and I wasn't sitting down to watch college football in those days. I started watching the NFL with my dad a couple years earlier, 1966. We had a team here. We had the Redskins. Maryland had a football team. They were never on TV, and they weren't good. And, occasionally you'd see a game on Ohio State, Michigan, or, USC and UCLA. And then in 1968, you begin to hear a lot about this guy, OJ Simpson, who has incredible talent in a way that we had never seen this before on the football field. We'd seen great running backs, but his ability to cut and move, maybe Gale Sayers had that in college, but nobody was watching, University of Kansas games in those days. No. You could see OJ, and you could see highlights, which were kind of new on TV as well. And he was spectacular in kind of the way that Caitlin Clark has been spectacular in women's basketball. College football in a much higher plane than women's basketball at the time, but because of television and because of the charismatic way that he carried himself on and off the field, OJ became that. And also, you have to remember this. This is a time of incredible racial strife in this country. OJ Simpson won the Heisman Trophy 6-7 months after Martin Luther King was killed, and we had horrible riots here in D.C. Realize this. The first black Heisman Trophy winner was Ernie Davis at Syracuse. And Ernie Davis could have become the first black player for the Redskins, but he didn't want to come there, and they traded his rights to the Cleveland Browns for Bobby Mitchell. Sadly, Ernie Davis died of leukemia, never played in the NFL. But if you look at the Heisman Trophy winners after him and before OJ, 5 of the 6 were white quarterbacks. Terry Baker, 62, out of Oregon State. Roger Staubach, Navy, 1963. John Hewitt, Notre Dame, 1964. Steve Spurrier, Florida, 1966. Gary Beban, 1967. Mike Garrett, a USC tailback, won it in 1965. But he went to the AFL, and the AFL was not really, it had yet to emerge because the Joe Namath game didn't happen until 4 years later. And so, while Mike Garrett was known, he didn't have that kind of star power that OJ had. And he took that star power and he took it to the NFL and he took it to the Buffalo Bills, and he was on Monday Night Football, and he had relationships with a variety of reporters. People liked him, people knew him, and all that carried over until 1994 when the murders happened and everything changed. And so the OJ pre-1994, much different than the OJ of 1994 on. But the main point is we didn't know this guy, and we didn't know about the spousal abuse that was going on, the horrible things that he was doing to Nicole, who he had moved in with when she was 18 years old while he was still married. All those things, we didn't know that, and we didn't want to know that. And then we found out about it, and we found out that we really don't know celebrities. We think we know. And I've always cringed when I've heard people like Mike Greenberg talk about celebrity athletes and what great guys they are. They seem to be, but you don't know. you don't necessarily know. One other note on this that you may not have heard, prior to his death, and they knew death was coming, he was dying of cancer, he had his children come visit him. He had two basic sets of children, one that he had with his first wife, Marguerite, and two that he had with Nicole. The two older ones are now 55 and 53. That's Ardell, who testified in the trial. Jason, who's now 53. He's the one that came out of the house when OJ arrived. And then the two younger ones who they've done a good job of keeping out of the spotlight. You have to say that. They're and I don't even know if they've changed their names, but it's Sydney, a girl, a woman now, 38, and Justin, 35. And as is reported by TMZ, when they went in to see their dad for the last time, they had to sign non-disclosure agreements and were not allowed to have their phones in the room while saying goodbye. I guess they didn't want any video to get out about this. And the non-disclosure is really significant because they now, I guess, cannot write tell-all books. At some point, you would think they would have asked their dad, did you do it, right? I mean, I think that's a question that you have to ask, and maybe he was honest with them, maybe he wasn't, but somebody would pay them a lot of money, even now, to write a book about OJ, and according to these non-disclosure agreements, they probably would not be allowed to do that. It would be interesting if they did it and challenged it in court, but that's what happened. As you may remember, while OJ was in jail, the younger kids went to live with the grandparents, but he got custody back after his acquittal. They lived with him for a while, and I don't know where they are now, and I don't think they want anybody to know where they are now. I don't think that's something that they want. They have remained out of the spotlight for 30 years, and that's exactly what they want to happen. Coming up, what Montez Sweat said about the name change this week. We'll get to that, and what pitching has become, and should there have been warning signs on this much earlier. We'll get to that and more as we continue. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
Tiger Woods winning the Masters, maybe not realistic. Tiger Woods making the cut, maybe. He's one over par after an opening round 73, which he finished up today. Had to stop after 12 holes yesterday, but played 6 more today, and has parred the first hole of his second round, which started, I guess, about half an hour ago. And we'll see. The cut line is expected to be at 2 over, so he's at 1 over now. The problem he's had, though, is his body has worn down as the rounds have gone on. So the likelihood that he's going to be effective playing 24 holes today doesn't seem great. But for people like me who are more Tiger fans than golf fans, it's something to keep an eye on. Though, Scotty Scheffler, as Scott Van Pelt said the other day, he had odds going into this like Tiger had in his prime. Overwhelming favorite to win, and came up with a 6 under yesterday. He's only a shot off the lead, and I think he'll be playing into the weekend and playing well. And it's very likely we'll be watching him come down the home stretch on Sunday with a chance to win a major, but we'll have to see. I talked about this earlier in the week that Montez Sweat was on the Green Light podcast, which is hosted by Chris Long. Howie Long's son played in the NFL, won a Super Bowl with the Eagles, won a Super Bowl with the Patriots, and now is getting into media and doing it with this podcast. And he had Montez Sweat on, and locally this got some play in that Sweat was asked about the team name, and he said he was embarrassed by the change to Commanders. And when you read the quote, you don't really get the full picture of what the quote was about. Was he embarrassed that it had been changed to that name, or was he embarrassed that over this period of time it went from Redskins to Washington Football Team to Commanders? Like, enough is enough. Like, this, and the way they rolled it out was embarrassing as well. I mean, just an awful rollout of the name and the way they did it, and with the news conference with Dan Snyder and his wife standing up there in Letterman's jackets. So this is the actual audio from the Green Light podcast as to what Montez Sweat, now with the Chicago Bears, said about his experience with the name in his years in Washington.
Every time I'm like, bro, why wouldn't we just be the Redskins? It's part of the culture. Like, what's the problem? So
yeah,
if it was up to me, we would have just been the Redskins to call it at that.
But anything but the Commanders, in my
Oh
opinion.
my
I thought
God.
the
When I
football
heard
team
that,
was
bro,
kind of cool.
I was so embarrassed. I was so embarrassed that when people asked me who I played for, I was Washington.
Washington
Commanders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's embarrassed by the name. That's interesting. That it wasn't necessarily the constant name change. He said he didn't understand why it didn't stay the Redskins. I mean, a significant portion of the fan base probably feels the same way. But the reality is it couldn't have stayed the Redskins. It just wasn't going to happen. And it's not going to go back. Some people think it's going to go back. It's not going to go back. But you had to have an understanding that it was going to change. But my feeling has been that they should stay with Washington Football Team and go back to it now and just call it Washington Football Team and be done with it. And people who grew up rooting for the Redskins, as I did, that will remain the nickname of the team in our minds. Not that we could publicly call them that or that they should publicly call themselves that, but it indicates the history of the team. It relates to that they had this name for all these years. There were periods of great success with it and incredible failure as well. But Commanders to me reminds me of the Snyder era, the change over to the name, how poorly it was done by the front office and Jason Wright taking responsibility for that. It was awful. It was an awful way they did it, and it's a name that nobody seems to be really excited about, evidenced by the fact they're not selling much gear. They're way down there. We heard for years, if they change the name, everybody will buy all the new gear. No, people aren't doing that. They aren't doing that at all. I didn't spend any time on this, and I guess in a day where we didn't have the OJ death, would have spent some significant time on it. But when you examine this, Ipe Musahara, the former translator for Shohei Ohtani, and the gambling, when it first broke, okay, we heard that he had lost $4.5 million. And initially you think, he made 9 bets of $500,000, lost them all. No. As we've looked into this, and again, he changed his story. First he told ESPN, Shohei paid off the debts. Then he said, he didn't know about it. And now, after an investigation, and Shohei is off the hook, the feds looked into this, and they said, he was a victim here. A U.S. Attorney, Martin Estrada, said a thorough investigation left no doubt that Mizuhara, the translator, had used and abused his position of trust to plunder Mr. Ohtani's bank account to the tune of over $16 million. I want to emphasize this point that Ohtani was a victim in the case. Now, I'm a little confused by the numbers. He stole $16 million, according to the FBI, but and this is the most mind-blowing part of this, is that he was averaging over a 2-year period 25 bets a day. He bet 1,900 times, sums of between like $25 and $15,000 on various games, and he lost actually $40 million. I assume that's Ohtani's money. I don't know what the 16 and the 40. I don't know how to match those up. But again, I go back to a Dan Patrick interview that was done pretty early in this, right after the news broke of this, and he talked to a gambling expert, and he said, look, for this guy to lose $4.5 million, he's got to bet between at least $80 to $100 million. Well, it turned out that he bet $180 million. $180 million, and came out $40 million in the red. So that is just incredible that there was all this action going on and nobody caught it. Now, according to the investigation and according to what Musahara told them, he was able to change the codes on the bank, and Ohtani was completely unaware of this. The other big takeaway on this, which is extremely important, even though there's legalized gambling, this was done with an illegal bookie in California, because California does not have legalized sports betting. Throughout the investigation, the initial reports, all the thorough look that they did in this, there's no evidence that as much as a schlemiel as this guy was, betting all this money and losing $40 million, he never bet on baseball. At least there's that, because that's the third rail. If you bet on baseball and the tentacles can be attached to Shohei, that's it. Game over. Game, set, match. But it never got to that. It never reached that point. One other baseball story. Tom Lovero's got a column today about how we should have really started to investigate this with the Steven Strasburg injury, which happened in his rookie year. And he says that, and I believe him, he wrote this at the time. Remember Strasburg, the incredible excitement when he came up in 2010, the 14 strikeouts in his first game. But September 3rd, so this is less than 2 months later, and we find out he needs Tommy John surgery. And Lovero writes, it should have been a 5-alarm call for action. Strasburg had a celebrated pitching arm before the Nationals selected him with the first pick in the 2009 draft. He was a hard-throwing star at San Diego State, called the most hyped and closely watched pitching prospect in the history of baseball by Sports Illustrated. That was before he exceeded the hype in his debut with 14 strikeouts of the Pirates in the 5-2 victory. Nearly 3 months later, after going 5-3 with a 2.91 ERA and 12 starts and averaging 12 strikeouts a game, Strasburg was on the operating room table having Tommy John surgery. And he said that's when baseball should have really had a full investigation as to what they're doing with the pitchers. And I remember we interviewed Tommy John himself on the air after Strasburg had come back. Remember, he sat out and came back at the end of the 2011 season. And Tommy John said, look, he's got to change his motion or he's going to get hurt again. Now, he never needed the second Tommy John, but a variety of injuries ended his career. And as Lovero writes, the career is defined by what-ifs as much as what he actually accomplished. And now we have a pitching crisis in baseball. And what he's saying is that should have been a big warning sign at the time. Hey, we got to change the way we're doing things. But instead, there was more emphasis on throwing harder, throw as long as you could, stints went shorter, and we've got more and more injuries, and now we got a full-blown crisis. And I remember this, too, that Jordan Zimmerman had the Tommy John surgery. Jordan Zimmerman with the Nats. And he had pitched well, and he threw the first no-hitter in team history. But when it came time to either re-sign him or let him go in free agency and sign Max Scherzer, which proved to be a brilliant move there, the feeling was, hey, Scherzer had never had the Tommy John surgery, and Zimmerman had it, and if you have it twice, it likely ends your career. And this was years ago. This is going back 11 years ago. And here we are now with pitchers on the shelf and baseball scratching its head what to do about that. So good stuff from Tom. That's it for me. Mike may have some further thoughts on OJ coming up. Tony returns on Monday. I will as well, and I'll see you then at 9 a.m.